The sun had barely crested the horizon when two brothers arrived at the abandoned copper mine on the outskirts of Butte, Montana, their weathered pickup truck kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust as it rumbled down the deteriorating access road. The younger brother, Marcus, gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands, his eyes fixed on the massive silhouette that dominated the landscape ahead. His older brother, Derek, sat in the passenger seat, a worn leather notebook open on his lap, filled with calculations and estimates that represented months of research and planning. The object of their attention was a behemoth that seemed almost prehistoric in its proportions, a Caterpillar 797 mining truck that had been sitting abandoned for nearly 8 years. The massive vehicle stood 3 stories tall, its faded yellow paint peeling away in great sheets, revealing the oxidized metal beneath. The tires alone were taller than a grown man, each one weighing several tons and costing more than a luxury sedan when new. But the brothers weren't interested in the truck's former glory or its operational history. They saw something far simpler and more immediate. Approximately 45 tons of scrap metal that could be dismantled, sold, and converted into desperately needed capital for their struggling salvage business. Marcus brought the pickup to a stop about 50 yards from the mining truck, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp morning air. Both brothers sat in silence for a moment, craning their necks to take in the full scale of what they had just purchased at auction for $18,000. The truck's cab sat so high above the ground that it seemed to touch the low-hanging clouds that drifted across the Montana sky. The dump bed, designed to carry 400 tons of or in a single load, stretched out behind the cab like the hull of a small ship. Rust streaked down from every joint and seam, painting abstract patterns across the metal surfaces. The auction had been sparsely attended, held in a drafty warehouse in town where the mining company had liquidated the last remnants of its assets before declaring bankruptcy. Most bidders had been interested in the smaller equipment, the portable generators and excavator attachments that could be easily transported and quickly resold. When the auctioneer had announced the mining truck, describing it as sold as is, where is, buyer responsible for all removal and transportation, the room had gone quiet. The logistics of moving such a massive piece of equipment were daunting enough to discourage all but the most ambitious or desperate bidders. Derek had raised his paddle 3 times, each bid met with silence from the handful of remaining attendees. The auctioneer's gavel had fallen with a sharp crack that seemed to echo with finality, and just like that, the brothers owned a vehicle that weighed more than a fully loaded 747 aircraft. They had spent the drive back to their salvage yard in near silence, each absorbed in private calculations about cutting equipment, transportation costs, and the current market price for various grades of scrap steel. Now, standing before their purchase in the pale morning light, the true magnitude of the task ahead began to settle over them like the dust that coated every surface. Marcus retrieved a heavy bolt cutter from the truck bed, while Derek gathered the collection of keys and access codes they had received from the auction house. The mining company had secured the vehicle before abandoning the site, installing heavy chains and industrial padlocks on every access point to prevent vandalism and unauthorized entry. The first lock surrendered after several minutes of effort, the hardened steel shackle finally yielding to the cutting jaws with a sharp metallic snap. The brothers worked methodically around the perimeter of the massive truck, removing chains that had begun to fuse with rust, cutting through cables that had been threaded through door handles and access panels. Each small victory brought them closer to gaining entry to the cab, where they hoped to find the vehicle's maintenance records and operational history, information that might prove valuable when dismantling the truck's various systems. The access ladder to the cab rose vertically up the side of the truck, each rung as thick as a man's wrist and spaced far enough apart to make climbing awkward. Marcus went first, testing each rung carefully before committing his full weight, acutely aware that an 8-year accumulation of rust and weather damage could make any structural element unreliable. Derek followed, carrying a canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder, the implements inside clanking softly with each upward step. The cab door required both brothers working in tandem to force it open, the hinges screaming in protest after years of disuse. When it finally swung wide, a rush of stale air escaped from the interior, carrying with it the scent of aged vinyl, decomposing foam, and the peculiar metallic odor that clings to places where machines have sat idle for extended periods. Sunlight streamed through the windshield, illuminating a cockpit that looked more like the bridge of a ship than the interior of a truck. The dashboard stretched nearly 6 feet across, covered with an array of gauges, switches, and indicator lights that had once monitored every aspect of the vehicle's operation. Marcus settled into the operator's seat, which creaked ominously under his weight, while Derek began opening compartments and storage bins, searching for the maintenance logs that operators typically kept on hand. The glove box yielded a treasure trove of documents, laminated checklists, emergency procedure cards, and a thick binder containing service records dating back to the truck's commissioning. Derek flipped through the pages with growing interest, noting the dates of major overhauls, component replacements, and the cumulative operating hours recorded at various intervals. According to the logs, the truck had accumulated just over 12,000 operating hours before being decommissioned, roughly equivalent to 700,000 miles of operation in harsh mining conditions. The engine had received a major overhaul at 8,000 hours, a standard maintenance procedure that involved replacing pistons, bearings, and numerous other components to ensure continued reliable operation. The total cost of that overhaul, noted in the margin by some conscientious mechanic, had exceeded $250,000. While Derek absorbed this information, Marcus had been examining the various systems within the cab, noting which components might have resale value beyond their weight in scrap metal. The GPS navigation unit, still mounted to the dashboard, was an industrial-grade system worth several $1,000s if functional. The radio communication equipment, sealed in a weatherproof housing, represented another potential revenue stream. The seat itself, despite its deteriorated condition, contained sophisticated pneumatic suspension systems that mining operations regularly needed to replace. But it was when Marcus reached down to open the storage compartment beneath the operator's seat that the morning took its first unexpected turn. Instead of the usual collection of maintenance supplies and personal effects, the compartment contained a small metal case, roughly the size of a briefcase, secured with a combination lock. The case was heavy, far heavier than its size would suggest, and when Marcus lifted it out into the light, both brothers could see that it bore the mining company's logo and a series of warning labels about unauthorized access and company property. They spent several minutes trying to open the case through various means before finally resorting to the bolt cutters. The lock proved more resistant than the chains outside had been, requiring Derek to brace the case while Marcus applied maximum pressure to the cutting jaws. When the lock finally gave way, they lifted the lid to reveal contents that made both men catch their breath simultaneously. The case was filled with core samples, cylindrical sections of rock extracted from test drilling operations, each one carefully labeled with depth measurements and geographical coordinates. But these weren't ordinary core samples. Even in the dim interior of the cab, the brothers could see the glitter of gold running through several of the specimens in thick, visible veins. Other samples showed concentrations of copper so dense that the metal appeared almost pure, and still others exhibited the distinctive greenish blue of turquoise or the silvery sheen of platinum group metals. The case contained approximately 40 samples in total, each one representing a potential strike that had been evaluated during the mine's exploration phase. Subscribe to the channel and hit that super thanks button to support more incredible stories like this one. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Derek carefully removed one of the gold-bearing samples, holding it up to the light streaming through the windshield. The metallic luster was unmistakable, and the weight of the specimen confirmed what their eyes were telling them. This wasn't merely trace amounts of gold dispersed through the rock matrix, but a genuine high-grade ore sample that would have justified immediate extraction if the mining company had possessed the resources to pursue it. According to the label, this particular core had been extracted from a depth of 840 feet, at coordinates that placed it somewhere in the western section of the property. The discovery transformed their perspective on the entire operation. What had seemed like a straightforward salvage job now carried implications that extended far beyond the value of scrap metal. If these core samples were authentic, and there was no apparent reason why they wouldn't be, then the mining company had shut down its operations not because the property was exhausted, but because of financial difficulties unrelated to the mineral content of the land itself. The bankruptcy proceedings they had read about had mentioned mismanagement, over-leveraged debt, and conflicts among the ownership group, but nothing about the depletion of viable ore deposits. Marcus set the case aside carefully and turned his attention to the other storage compartments in the cab, suddenly viewing everything with fresh eyes. Behind a panel on the passenger side, he discovered another sealed container, this one waterproof and bearing multiple warning labels about heat sensitivity and electronic components. Inside, wrapped in protective foam, was a portable GPS data logger, a sophisticated device used by geologists to record precise locations during survey operations. The unit's memory card was still inserted, potentially containing detailed coordinates for every test bore and sample location across the entire property. But the brothers knew they needed to maintain focus on their primary objective. The core samples and geological data represented an intriguing possibility, but they were here to dismantle a mining truck, not to launch an exploration venture they lacked the expertise and capital to pursue. Derek photographed each core sample with his phone, noting the label information and capturing clear images of the mineral content. They would secure this material and investigate its significance later, but for now, the truck itself demanded their attention. They climbed down from the cab and began a careful inspection of the vehicle's exterior, looking for the access points to the engine compartment and the various systems they would need to disconnect before beginning the dismantling process. The engine was located at the rear of the truck, behind the cab and ahead of the massive dump bed. The access covers were secured with industrial fasteners that required specialized tools to remove, but the brothers had come prepared with a comprehensive toolkit assembled specifically for this job. The first cover came away to reveal a glimpse of the power plant beneath, a Detroit Diesel Series 92 engine that appeared far larger than the engines found in typical commercial trucks. This particular variant displaced over 2,000 cubic inches and, when operational, had produced approximately 2,500 horsepower to move the truck's enormous mass and its 400-ton payload. The engine block alone weighed several tons, cast from high-grade alloy steel designed to withstand the constant stress of mining operations. Marcus leaned in with a flashlight, examining the visible components for obvious damage or deterioration. What he saw surprised him. Despite 8 years of exposure to Montana weather, the engine appeared to be in remarkably good condition. The valve covers showed minimal corrosion, the various hoses and belts looked intact, and there were no obvious signs of the catastrophic failure that often led to vehicles being abandoned in place. He reached in to check the dipstick, finding that the engine oil, while aged, was still present at the full mark and showed no signs of contamination. Derek had moved to the opposite side of the engine bay, removing additional access covers to evaluate the auxiliary systems, the hydraulic pumps, cooling system, and the massive transmission that connected the engine to the vehicle's drivetrain. Each system appeared complete and largely undamaged, showing only the superficial deterioration expected from extended exposure to the elements. This observation raised a significant question. Why had a truck with an apparently functional engine been abandoned rather than being relocated to another mine site or sold to operations elsewhere? The answer to that question emerged as they continued their examination of the engine and its surrounding systems. Mounted on a bracket near the firewall, they discovered a metal tag bearing a serial number and a series of technical specifications. Derek consulted his phone, searching through online databases of industrial equipment, and what he found provided context for everything they had observed. This particular engine was a relatively rare variant, one of fewer than 2 dozen produced for specific mining applications. The engine had been custom configured with several proprietary modifications, including a specialized fuel injection system and enhanced lubrication circuits designed to extend service intervals in remote operations. The replacement value of this engine, according to the parts catalogs Derek pulled up on his phone, exceeded $400,000, and that was assuming one could even find a replacement unit available for purchase. The specialized components meant that many standard diesel parts couldn't be substituted, and the modifications made it unsuitable for retrofit into other truck models without extensive engineering work. In essence, the engine was simultaneously extremely valuable to someone who needed specifically this type of unit, and nearly worthless to the general market due to its specialized nature. But there was another market the brothers hadn't initially considered, the market for industrial museum exhibits and private collectors who specialized in mining equipment. A fully functional mining truck of this class was increasingly rare, as most were eventually scrapped when they reached the end of their operational lives. The trucks that survived typically did so because they had historical significance or because someone recognized their value as examples of industrial engineering. This particular truck, with its low operating hours and apparently functional systems, could potentially be worth far more as a restored vehicle than as scrap metal. Marcus stood back from the engine bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he processed this revelation. The $18,000 they had paid at auction suddenly seemed like either the bargain of a lifetime or the opening bid on a project that could consume years of their lives and tens of thousands of dollars in additional investment. The responsible business decision would be to proceed with the original plan. Part out the valuable components, scrap the rest, take their profit, and move on to the next project. The ambitious decision would be to attempt to restore the truck to operational condition and seek out buyers in the specialized collector market. Derek voiced what they were both thinking. They needed expert evaluation before making any irreversible decisions. Cutting apart an engine worth $400,000 would be a tragedy if there was any realistic chance of getting it running again. They needed to bring in a diesel mechanic with mining equipment experience, someone who could assess whether the engine could be recommissioned or whether its value truly lay only in its weight as scrap. The morning had advanced into afternoon by the time they finished their preliminary inspection. They had documented everything with photographs and notes, creating a comprehensive record of the truck's condition and the various discoveries they had made. The core samples were secured in the cab, along with the GPS data logger and the maintenance logs. Before departing, they installed new locks on all the access points, using their own heavy-duty padlocks and chains to secure the vehicle until they could arrange for the next phase of the operation. The drive back to their salvage yard was filled with animated discussion, both brothers simultaneously excited by the possibilities and anxious about the risks. They were salvage operators with decades of combined experience in dismantling vehicles and industrial equipment, but neither had ever dealt with anything on this scale or with this level of complexity. The truck represented a pivot point, a decision that could either establish their business on a new level or become a cautionary tale about overreach and poor judgment. Upon reaching the yard, Derek immediately began making phone calls, reaching out to contacts in the mining industry and the heavy equipment restoration community. He explained the situation in careful terms, providing just enough detail to gauge interest without revealing the specific nature of their discovery or the location of the truck. The responses were uniformly enthusiastic. Multiple people wanted to see the vehicle, several offered to provide evaluations, and one collector in Wyoming expressed immediate interest in purchasing the truck sight unseen if it was genuinely as described. Marcus, meanwhile, began researching the feasibility of actually moving the truck from the abandoned mine site to a location where restoration work could be performed. The vehicle weighed approximately 120 tons empty, requiring specialized heavy-haul equipment to transport. The nearest company capable of moving such a load was based in Billings, over 200 miles away, and their quote for the job exceeded $30,000. That figure didn't include the cost of obtaining the necessary permits, arranging for road closures, or the engineering work required to ensure that every bridge and overpass along the route could safely support the truck's passage. As they absorbed these realities, a third option began to emerge. What if the truck could be restored on-site at the abandoned mine location? The property was secured, the weather would be favorable for the next several months, and working on location would eliminate the enormous cost and complexity of transportation. They would need to set up a temporary workshop, bring in equipment and supplies, and probably camp on site for the duration of the project, but it was potentially feasible. That evening, sitting in the cramped office of their salvage yard, the brothers spread out all their documentation across a battered desk that had seen decades of similar deliberations. The photographs of the core samples were particularly striking under the fluorescent lights, the gold and copper clearly visible even in digital form. Derek had spent an hour researching the current market prices for precious metals and had calculated rough estimates of the value contained in just those 40 samples. Assuming the mineral content was representative of the concentrations throughout the labeled deposits, they were looking at potential values ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per acre. But mining claims and mineral rights were a completely different business, one that required navigating complex regulations, securing permits, dealing with environmental assessments, and investing substantial capital before extracting the first ounce of ore. The brothers knew nothing about that world beyond what they had gleaned from news reports and documentaries. The truck, by contrast, was a tangible asset they could see, touch, and evaluate using their existing expertise. Marcus pulled up the collector's contact information on his phone and drafted a careful email. He described the truck in detail, attached several of the best photographs, and outlined the situation honestly. They had purchased it for scrap but had discovered it might be worth more as a restoration project. He quoted the figures they had researched for replacement engines and components, noted the low operating hours and apparent functional condition of major systems, and invited the collector to visit and evaluate the vehicle in person. The email sent with a soft whoosh, vanishing into the digital ether to await a response that might change everything. Sleep came with difficulty that night, both brothers lying awake in their respective homes, turning the problem over from every angle. By morning, Marcus had received a response from the collector, a detailed message expressing serious interest and a willingness to travel to Montana within the week to personally inspect the truck. The collector explained that he operated a private museum dedicated to mining equipment and had been searching for a Caterpillar 797 to complete his collection. He had the resources to fund a proper restoration and the connections to source the necessary parts and expertise. The week passed in a blur of activity. The brothers returned to the mine site repeatedly, conducting increasingly detailed inspections of every accessible system on the truck. They brought in a diesel mechanic from town, a grizzled veteran of the mining industry who had worked on similar vehicles during his career. The mechanic spent an entire day examining the engine, using a borescope to inspect the cylinders, testing the compression, checking valve clearances, and evaluating the condition of the fuel and lubrication systems. His verdict was cautiously optimistic. The engine appeared sound, with no obvious internal damage and only normal where consistent with its recorded operating hours. The extended period of sitting idle was actually a point in its favor, as it meant the engine hadn't accumulated additional wear during that time. With proper recommissioning procedures, replacing all fluids, installing new filters, checking and adjusting all clearances, and performing system tests, there was a reasonable chance the engine could be brought back to operational condition. The cost for this work, performed on-site with proper equipment, would likely fall in the range of $40,000 to $60,000, a fraction of the replacement cost. The collector arrived on schedule, flying into Butte and renting a truck to drive out to the mine site. He was a lean man in his 60s with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent a lifetime around heavy equipment. He approached the mining truck with an almost reverent attitude, walking completely around it twice before speaking, taking in every detail of its massive proportions and current condition. When he finally climbed up into the cab, he spent nearly an hour there alone, operating controls, checking systems, and absorbing the feel of the vehicle. When he descended, his first question was about the engine. Marcus and Derek walked him through their findings, showing him the mechanic's notes and explaining the cautiously optimistic assessment they had received. The collector nodded thoughtfully, then spent another hour examining the engine bay himself, occasionally making notes in a small book he carried. His examination was thorough and professional, that of someone who knew exactly what to look for and how to evaluate what he found. Finally, standing in the shadow of the massive truck as the afternoon sun angled toward the horizon, the collector made an offer. He would purchase the truck for $85,000, as is, where is, with the condition that the brothers assist in the initial phase of the restoration work. He would cover all costs associated with recommissioning the engine and systems, would handle all the logistics of eventually transporting the truck to his museum, and would credit the brothers' salvage business in all future displays and documentation of the vehicle. The offer represented a profit of $67,000 on their initial investment, a substantial return by any measure, but less than they might achieve if they parted out the vehicle and scrapped the remains. Derek asked for time to consider, and the collector agreed to wait 24 hours for their decision. As they watched him drive away, both brothers understood that they were facing a decision that was about more than just money. It was about what kind of business they wanted to operate and what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. That evening, they visited a local diner, ordering coffee and sitting in a booth by the window as darkness settled over the town. They talked through the options one more time, weighing the guaranteed profit against the larger but less certain potential of other paths. There was also the matter of the core samples and geological data, which they had been careful not to mention to the collector. Those materials represented a separate consideration, a wild card that might or might not have any real value. Marcus suggested they reach out to a geological consulting firm, someone who could evaluate the core samples professionally and advise them on whether pursuing mineral rights made any sense. Derek made a note to do so, but both brothers recognized that mining claims were a long-term proposition, potentially taking years to develop even in the best circumstances. The truck decision needed to be made now, tomorrow, while they had a committed buyer and a clear offer on the table. By morning, they had reached their conclusion. They would accept the collector's offer, with one additional condition. They wanted to be present when the truck's engine was first started after restoration, and they wanted documentation of that moment to share with customers and contacts in their salvage business. The collector readily agreed, seeing the value in having the brothers' endorsement and participation in the project's success story. The paperwork was completed within days, the collector's payment arriving via wire transfer and landing in the brothers' business account with digital efficiency. They spent the next week working alongside the restoration team that the collector assembled, a group of specialized mechanics and equipment operators who descended on the mine site with a trailer full of tools, diagnostic equipment, and replacement components. The recommissioning process was methodical and precise. Every fluid system was drained, flushed, and refilled with fresh products. Filters throughout the vehicle were replaced with new units. The fuel system received special attention, as diesel fuel that sits for years can develop microbial growth and other contamination that would damage modern injection systems. The batteries, long since dead, were replaced with a bank of new heavy-duty units. Electrical connections were cleaned and protected. Hydraulic hoses were inspected and several were replaced as a precautionary measure. The mechanic who had provided the initial assessment supervised this work, his experienced eye-catching details that less knowledgeable workers might have overlooked. He insisted on performing a complete valve adjustment, despite the compression test results suggesting they were within tolerance. He spent hours checking and adjusting the fuel injection timing, using specialized tools to ensure that each of the engine's 12 cylinders would receive precisely the right amount of fuel at exactly the right moment. 3 weeks into the restoration work, the moment arrived. The engine had been prepared, all systems checked and rechecked, and the mechanic declared himself satisfied that an initial start attempt could be made safely. The collector had invited a small group to witness this moment. The brothers, several members of the restoration crew, and a videographer he had hired to document the entire project for his museum's archives. The starting procedure for an engine of this size was complex, requiring several preliminary steps before the actual ignition attempt. Electrical systems were powered up, and there was a collective moment of satisfaction when dashboard lights and gauges flickered to life, responding to controls after 8 years of silence. The pre-lubrication system was activated, an electrically driven pump that circulated oil throughout the engine to ensure adequate lubrication was present before combustion began. This process ran for several minutes, the pump's quiet hum barely audible over the ambient sounds of wind and distant wildlife. The mechanic climbed into the cab, settling into the operator's seat with practiced ease. He worked through a pre-start checklist, verifying that all controls were in their proper positions, that safety systems were functional, and that everyone was clear of the vehicle and aware that the engine start was imminent. His hand moved to the starter button, pausing there for a moment as if acknowledging the significance of what came next. When he pressed the button, the starter motor engaged with a powerful whirring sound, turning the massive engine slowly but steadily. For several seconds, there was only that mechanical whirring, the starter struggling to rotate the engine's internal components against the resistance of 8 years of inactivity. Then, with a sound that seemed to shake the air itself, the engine fired. The initial combustion was rough, uneven, as individual cylinders awakened at different moments. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stack, the accumulated residue of old fuel and oil burning away in a dramatic plume. But the engine didn't stall. It continued to run, and as it warmed, the combustion smoothed out, the rough clattering giving way to a powerful, rhythmic rumble that spoke of precision engineering and massive power held in check. The mechanic let it idle for several minutes, watching the gauges intently, looking for any sign of problems or abnormal readings. Oil pressure climbed to normal. Temperature began to rise in a controlled manner. The charging system showed the batteries receiving current. Every indicator suggested that the engine was functioning as designed. When the mechanic finally shut it down, the silence that followed seemed almost overwhelming. The group that had gathered stood in stunned appreciation of what they had just witnessed, a machine that had been written off as scrap, resurrected through expertise and persistence, proving that proper engineering and maintenance could indeed stand the test of time. The collector approached Marcus and Derek, shaking their hands with genuine emotion. He thanked them for preserving the vehicle, for resisting the easier path of immediate dismantlement, and for giving him the opportunity to add this magnificent example of mining equipment to his collection. He spoke about the educational value of the truck, how visitors to his museum would be able to appreciate the scale and power of the machines that extracted the raw material civilization depended upon. But the story didn't end with a successful engine start. Over the following weeks, as the restoration continued and the truck was gradually brought to full operational status, the brothers pursued the other thread of their discovery. They had contacted a geological consulting firm, sending samples from several of the cores they had found. The analysis came back detailed and professional, confirming what their eyes had suggested. The ore samples showed significant concentrations of valuable minerals, including gold, copper, and several rare earth elements. The consulting firm also examined the GPS data logger, extracting the coordinates and creating detailed maps showing the locations of every test bore that had been conducted across the property. When this data was overlaid with geological surveys and historical mining records, a picture emerged of a property with substantial untapped mineral potential. The mining company hadn't failed because the resources were exhausted. They had failed because of management problems and financial issues unrelated to the underlying value of the land. The brothers faced another decision, one that would require them to think far beyond their experience in salvage operations. They could sell the core samples and geological data to an established mining operation, taking a finder's fee and walking away clean. Or they could use the profits from the truck sale as seed capital to secure mineral rights and pursue development of the property themselves, entering an entirely new industry with all its attendant risks and opportunities. They spent weeks researching, consulting with experts, and running financial projections. The minerals were definitely there, and the potential value was substantial. But developing a mine would require environmental studies, permit applications, infrastructure development, and millions of dollars in capital investment before the first ton of or could be extracted. It was a multi-year proposition with numerous points where the entire venture could be derailed by regulatory issues, market changes, or unexpected technical challenges. In the end, they chose a middle path. They sold the geological data and mineral rights to an established mining company with the expertise and capital to properly develop the property. The sale netted them an additional $270,000, paid partly up front and partly as a royalty agreement that would provide ongoing income if the mine eventually entered production. Combined with the profit from the truck sale, the brothers found themselves in a financial position they had never imagined when they first placed that auction bid months earlier. The mining truck, meanwhile, completed its transformation. The restoration team had worked through every system methodically. The transmission was serviced, the hydraulics were rebuilt, the electrical system was updated with new wiring where necessary, and the massive tires were replaced with fresh rubber that had never touched the ground. The exterior was cleaned, rust was treated, and sections of the body were repainted in the original Caterpillar yellow. The result was a vehicle that looked very nearly as it had when it first rolled off the assembly line decades earlier. The collector arranged for the truck to be featured in a mining equipment exhibition before its final transport to his museum. The event drew crowds of former miners, equipment operators, engineers, and industrial history enthusiasts who marveled at the fully restored vehicle. Marcus and Derek attended, finding themselves somewhat uncomfortable with the attention but proud of the role they had played in preserving this example of industrial engineering. During the exhibition, they met other collectors and preservationists, building connections that would prove valuable in their future salvage operations. Word spread in the industry about their approach. how they had recognized the value beyond scrap weight, how they had sought expert opinions before making irreversible decisions, and how they had ultimately prioritized preservation over immediate profit. These stories enhanced their reputation, leading to referrals and opportunities they would never have encountered otherwise. The experience fundamentally changed how the brothers approached their business. They continued to operate their salvage yard, but with a new awareness that sometimes the greatest value in a piece of equipment wasn't in its weight or its component parts, but in its integrity as a complete and functioning example of human engineering. They became known as salvage operators who would take the time to properly evaluate equipment, who would connect valuable machines with people who could preserve and restore them, and who could be trusted to handle complex projects with professionalism and care. The mining property, under its new ownership, entered the permitting process for development. The brothers received regular updates about the progress, learning about environmental assessments, community engagement processes, and the complex regulatory framework governing modern mining operations. The company pursuing the development was experienced and well-financed, but even they acknowledged that bringing the mine into production would take years of work and navigating numerous bureaucratic hurdles. As the first anniversary of their truck purchase approached, Marcus and Derek reflected on the unexpected journey that single auction bid had initiated. They had started with $18,000 and a plan to scrap a mining truck for profit. They had ended with nearly $400,000 in combined proceeds, a reputation as thoughtful salvage operators, valuable connections in multiple industries, and ongoing royalty income from mineral rights they hadn't even known existed when they started. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and support the channel with a super thanks to help us bring you more amazing stories. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought of this incredible journey. The brothers understood that they had been exceptionally fortunate. The convergence of the core samples, the surprisingly good condition of the engine, and the appearance of a committed collector at exactly the right moment had created an outcome that couldn't have been predicted or planned. But they also recognized that their decisions had mattered. They could have scrapped the truck immediately. They could have ignored the core samples. They could have accepted the first offer without research or reflection. At each decision point, they had chosen the path that preserved options and gathered more information before committing to irreversible actions. These principles became the foundation of their evolved business model. They trained themselves to look beyond the obvious value in every piece of equipment they evaluated. They built relationships with experts who could provide specialized knowledge when needed. They learned to recognize when a project justified additional investment of time and resources, and when the straightforward approach was genuinely the best path forward. The story of the mining truck became something they shared with other salvage operators, not as boasting but as an illustration of what was possible when experience met opportunity and careful decision-making. They acknowledged their luck but also emphasized the importance of knowledge, patience, and the willingness to seek expert guidance when operating outside one's area of expertise. Years later, when the mine finally entered production and the first ore was extracted from the deposits identified by those core samples, the brothers received an invitation to attend the opening ceremony. They stood with company executives, government officials, and community leaders, watching as the first trucks rolled through the gates carrying their precious cargo. The royalty check they received that quarter exceeded their combined annual income from the salvage yard, a reminder of how a single day's work examining an abandoned mining truck had created ripples that extended far into their future. The Caterpillar 797 found its permanent home in the Collector's Museum, where it served as the centerpiece of an exhibition about modern mining equipment. A plaque mounted near the vehicle told its story, including the brothers' role in preserving it and the unexpected discoveries that had accompanied its restoration. School groups touring the museum would stand beneath the massive truck, craning their necks to see the cab high above, learning about the scale of machinery used to extract the minerals that powered modern technology. The brothers visited the museum occasionally, always experiencing a sense of surreal pride when they saw the truck displayed so prominently. It seemed impossible that this massive machine, which had appeared to be nothing more than scrap metal on that dusty morning months earlier, now stood as a preserved example of industrial history, maintained in operational condition for future generations to appreciate. Their salvage yard continued to operate, though on a larger scale and with a more selective approach to the projects they accepted. They hired additional staff, invested in better equipment, and developed expertise in specialized areas of salvage work. The reputation they had built opened doors to projects they never would have been considered for previously. Complex industrial dismantlement jobs, vintage equipment restoration contracts, and consulting work for other operators facing decisions about whether to scrap or preserve unusual items. Marcus developed a particular interest in mining equipment history, spending his evenings reading technical manuals and historical accounts of the industry's evolution. He built a personal library of reference materials and became a resource for others seeking information about vintage mining machines. Derek focused more on the business side, developing relationships with museums, collectors, and restoration specialists who represented potential markets for equipment that deserved preservation rather than destruction. They never found another project quite like the mining truck, nothing that combined so many unexpected elements in such a perfect convergence of opportunity and timing. But they didn't need to. The lessons learned from that experience informed every subsequent decision they made, creating a foundation of knowledge and intuition that proved valuable across countless smaller projects and opportunities. One of their next significant undertakings came 18 months after the truck sale, when they were contacted by the liquidator handling the closure of a regional railroad maintenance facility. The facility had operated for nearly a century, maintaining locomotives and rolling stock for freight operations across the northwestern states. Among the equipment being auctioned was a vintage diesel-electric locomotive from the 1950s, a model that had been retired from active service decades earlier but had been kept on the property as a yard switcher and emergency backup. The locomotive bore superficial similarities to the mining truck situation. It was large, complex, specialized equipment that most bidders would view primarily as scrap metal. But the brothers approached it differently now, immediately beginning research into collector markets, historical significance, and restoration feasibility before the auction even took place. They discovered that this particular locomotive model was increasingly rare, with only a handful of operational examples remaining in preservation. Railroad museums and heritage railways were actively seeking such units for their collections. Armed with this knowledge, they attended the auction with a predetermined maximum bid that reflected the locomotive's potential value beyond scrap. They won the bidding at $23,000, beating out two scrap dealers who had calculated their offers based solely on tonnage and current metal prices. Within a week, they had been contacted by 3 different preservation organizations interested in acquiring the locomotive. The subsequent sale to a Colorado Heritage Railway netted them $57,000, and the railway's maintenance crew later reported that the locomotive required minimal work to return to operational condition. This pattern repeated across various projects and equipment types. A vintage fire truck from a closed mining camp, initially valued for its copper and brass components, was instead sold to a fire service museum for several times the scrap value. An old industrial sawmill, slated for demolition, was carefully dismantled and sold to a living history park where it was restored as a working demonstration of historical logging practices. A collection of antique mining tools and equipment, found in a sealed storage room during a demolition project, was catalogued and sold to collectors rather than being sent to the scrapyard with the building's structural steel. Not every project followed this pattern, of course. Much of their work remained straightforward salvage, vehicles totaled beyond repair, obsolete industrial equipment with no collector interest, buildings demolished to make way for new development. The brothers became adept at recognizing which items justified the additional effort of seeking preservation-minded buyers and which should simply be processed efficiently through their normal salvage channels. The mining property development progressed through its various phases, though more slowly than the operating company had initially projected. Environmental assessments revealed the need for additional mitigation measures. Community concerns required multiple rounds of public hearings and negotiations. Engineering challenges emerged as the complexity of the underground deposits became clearer. But the company remained committed, and the brothers' royalty agreement ensured they would benefit from eventual production regardless of how long development took. They used a portion of their windfall to diversify beyond the salvage business. Marcus invested in a small equipment rental company, recognizing that construction and industrial operations constantly needed temporary access to specialized machinery. Derek pursued real estate opportunities, purchasing and renovating several commercial properties in town. Both brothers maintained their involvement in the salvage yard, but they were no longer entirely dependent on it for their financial security. The relationships they had built during the mining truck project continued to pay dividends in unexpected ways. The diesel mechanic who had evaluated the engine became a regular consultant for their more complex projects. The collector who had purchased the truck referred several other potential buyers their way when they acquired items that might interest preservation-minded purchasers. The geological consulting firm they had worked with occasionally asked them to evaluate mining equipment being decommissioned at other sites, creating a new revenue stream as informal brokers between mining operations and equipment buyers. Their success also brought increased scrutiny and competition. Other salvage operators began paying more attention to potential preservation value, sometimes driving up auction prices for items that might have previously sold cheap. Equipment collectors became more sophisticated about evaluating condition and authenticity, making it harder to achieve the exceptional margins the brothers had enjoyed in their early projects after the truck sale. The market was adapting, as markets always do, reaching a new equilibrium that reflected the increased awareness of value beyond scrap weight. But the brothers had established themselves during that transitional period, building a reputation and a network that continued to provide advantages even as competition intensified. They were known as fair dealers who provided honest assessments, who honored their commitments, and who could be trusted to handle complex projects professionally. These intangible assets proved as valuable as any physical inventory they maintained. As the third anniversary of the truck purchase approached, the mining property reached a significant milestone: the completion of the environmental impact statement and the issuance of the primary operating permits. The company announced plans to begin site preparation within 6 months, with actual extraction operations commencing approximately 18 months after that. The brothers received updated projections showing the potential royalty income once the mine reached full production, figures that seemed almost fantastical compared to their original expectations when they had purchased an abandoned truck for scrap. They used this occasion to reflect on the journey, sitting once again in that same diner booth where they had made so many crucial decisions. The conversation turned philosophical, exploring questions about luck versus skill, about recognizing opportunity versus creating it, about the role of knowledge and preparation in enabling people to capitalize on fortunate circumstances. Marcus argued that while they had certainly been lucky in many respects, that luck would have been meaningless without the knowledge to recognize what they had found and the judgment to seek expert guidance rather than charging ahead blindly. Derek countered that even the best knowledge and judgment would have been useless if the core samples hadn't been there, if the engine hadn't been in good condition, if the collector hadn't appeared at the right moment. They ultimately agreed that success at that level required both elements: the favorable circumstances and the capability to recognize and exploit them. This understanding informed how they approached their business going forward and how they mentored the younger workers they had hired. They emphasized the importance of continuous learning, of building expertise not just in the mechanical aspects of salvage work but in the markets and communities that might value equipment in ways that weren't immediately obvious. They encouraged their employees to ask questions, to seek additional information before making irreversible decisions, and to always consider whether an item might have value beyond its weight in scrap. They also shared the story of the mining truck widely, speaking at industry conferences and contributing to trade publications. Their message was consistent: the salvage industry was evolving, and operators who recognized this evolution and adapted their practices accordingly would thrive, while those who clung to outdated approaches focused solely on tonnage and commodity prices would find themselves at an increasing disadvantage. Not everyone appreciated this message. Some traditional salvage operators viewed the brothers' approach as unnecessarily complicated, as introducing inefficiency and uncertainty into what should be a straightforward business of buying low, processing efficiently, and selling for a reliable margin. These operators argued that the mining truck story was an outlier, a once-in-a-lifetime convergence that didn't justify changing established business practices. The brothers didn't argue with this perspective, acknowledging that their approach required more time, more research, and more willingness to walk away from opportunities that didn't justify the additional effort. They conceded that not every salvage operator would find this model appealing or practical. but they maintained that the industry contained more opportunities for creative value extraction than most operators recognized, and that those willing to develop the expertise and connections to pursue those opportunities would find themselves competing in a less crowded, more profitable space. The mining property finally commenced active operations in the 4th year after the brothers' initial discovery of the core samples. The first blast occurred on a clear autumn morning, witnessed by company executives, government officials, and the brothers themselves, who had been invited as special guests in recognition of their role in bringing the property's potential to light. The explosion sent tons of rock cascading down in a carefully controlled collapse, exposing the ore-bearing formations that would feed the processing operation for years to come. Production ramped up gradually, as was typical for new mining operations. The initial output was modest, limited by the capacity of the processing facilities and the need to establish reliable operational procedures. But within 18 months, the mine had reached its projected production targets, extracting and processing thousands of tons ore monthly. The brothers' royalty checks began arriving quarterly, each one representing a percentage of the value extracted from the deposits those core samples had identified. The amounts varied based on commodity prices, ore grades, and operational efficiency, but they consistently exceeded anything the brothers had earned in their best years operating solely as salvage dealers. This income provided security and options, allowing them to be increasingly selective about which projects they pursued and which they declined. They could afford to turn down straightforward scrap jobs that offered only modest margins, focusing instead on the more complex opportunities that aligned with their expertise and interests. Marcus eventually wrote a book about their experiences, a practical guide for salvage operators interested in exploring preservation and collector markets. The book covered evaluation techniques, research methods, networking strategies, and case studies from their various projects. It also included a detailed account of the mining truck story, presented not as a tale of exceptional luck but as an example of how knowledge, judgment, and calculated risk-taking could transform an apparently ordinary salvage opportunity into something far more significant. The book found a modest but dedicated audience among salvage operators, equipment collectors, and industrial history enthusiasts. It led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities, further diversifying the brothers' income streams and professional activities. Marcus discovered he enjoyed teaching, sharing what he had learned with others who were trying to navigate the evolving landscape of the salvage industry. Derek, meanwhile, had become increasingly involved in community development efforts, using the resources generated by their various successes to support projects that enhanced their town's economic vitality. He invested in a business incubator supporting local entrepreneurs, funded scholarships for students pursuing skilled trades, and supported the renovation of historical buildings downtown. These activities weren't purely philanthropic. They served to strengthen the community that had been his home his entire life, creating an environment where businesses like their salvage operation could continue to thrive. The mining truck itself remained on display at the Collectors Museum, where it continued to attract visitors and generate interest in industrial history. The museum had expanded its exhibits to include detailed information about the truck's discovery, restoration, and the broader story of mining equipment evolution. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore virtual representations of the truck systems, understanding the engineering that enabled such machines to operate reliably in harsh conditions while moving enormous loads. On the 5th anniversary of their original purchase, the collector invited the brothers to the museum for a special event. The truck would be started and operated for visitors as part of a demonstration of historical mining equipment. They attended, bringing their families and some of the key people who had been involved in the restoration project. Watching the massive truck rumble to life once again, its engine producing that distinctive powerful thunder, they experienced a sense of completion and satisfaction that went beyond financial success. The demonstration also included presentations about the mining industry's history, the evolution of extraction techniques, and the environmental and social considerations that shaped modern mining operations. Representatives from the company operating the mine that the brothers' core samples had helped identify were present, discussing how contemporary mining balanced resource extraction with environmental stewardship and community impact. The event tied together multiple threads: preservation of industrial heritage, responsible resource development, and the importance of recognizing value in unexpected places. In the years that followed, the brothers continued their work, though at a more measured pace than the frenetic activity that had characterized their business in earlier decades. They were more selective about projects, focusing on opportunities that offered either exceptional financial potential or unusual learning experiences. They mentored younger salvage operators entering the field, sharing hard-won knowledge about evaluation techniques, market trends, and the importance of building strong professional networks. The salvage yard itself evolved into something of a hybrid operation, part traditional scrapyard processing commodity materials, part brokerage connecting sellers of specialized equipment with appropriate buyers, part consulting service helping others evaluate complex salvage opportunities. This diversified model proved resilient across changing economic conditions and market cycles, generating stable income even when commodity prices fluctuated or when construction activity slowed. They never forgot the lessons from that morning when they first climbed into the cab of an abandoned mining truck and discovered core samples that would change their trajectory. The importance of thorough investigation before making irreversible decisions. The value of expert consultation when operating outside one's area of deep expertise. The reality that patience and additional investment of time could sometimes yield returns far exceeding what quick action would produce. These principles had been reinforced across dozens of subsequent projects, becoming core elements of their business philosophy. The mining operation continued producing steadily, the quarterly royalty checks a constant reminder of how a single decision to look beyond the obvious had created an ongoing income stream. The brothers used these funds wisely, building financial security while also supporting causes and initiatives they believed in. They had reached a point in their lives where success was measured not just in dollars earned but in impact created, knowledge shared, and opportunities provided to others. Looking back across the full arc of their journey, from that auction where they purchased a truck for scrap to the multifaceted business they now operated, the brothers recognized how much had changed and yet how much had remained constant. They were still fundamentally salvage operators, still making their living by recognizing value that others overlooked. But their definition of value had expanded far beyond weight and commodity prices, encompassing historical significance, preservation potential, collector interest, and even the hidden geological data that could transform an abandoned mining site into a productive operation. This story, this journey from a simple scrap purchase to unexpected prosperity, became something they shared not as boasting but as illustration of possibilities that existed for those willing to look beyond the obvious, to invest in knowledge and relationships, and to make decisions based on thorough evaluation rather than gut instinct alone. The mining truck had been their teacher, revealing lessons that extended far beyond the mechanics of dismantling large equipment or the market for industrial scrap metal. If there was a single insight that captured what they had learned, it was this: every piece of equipment, every structure, every item that crossed through their salvage yard had a story and potentially multiple forms of value. Their job wasn't simply to extract the most obvious value as efficiently as possible, but to understand each item well enough to determine which form of value was most appropriate to pursue. Sometimes that meant processing it quickly for scrap. Sometimes it meant investing significant effort to connect it with preservation-minded buyers. Sometimes it meant recognizing that hidden within or associated with the physical object was information or opportunity that exceeded the value of the object itself. The core samples had been exactly that, information that exceeded the value of the truck that led to their discovery. The brothers had been wise enough to recognize this, patient enough to investigate it thoroughly, and fortunate enough to find buyers who could extract value from both the physical truck and the geological information. This combination of wisdom, patience, and good fortune had created an outcome that still seemed almost improbable when they reflected on it years later. As they entered what they expected to be the final decades of their working lives, the brothers found themselves in a position they had never anticipated. They had financial security from multiple income streams. They had respect within their industry as innovators who had helped expand understanding of what salvage work could encompass. They had made meaningful contributions to their community through various investments and initiatives. And they had preserved several significant examples of industrial equipment that might otherwise have been lost to the scrapyard, allowing future generations to appreciate the engineering achievements of earlier eras. The mining truck stood as the centerpiece of this legacy, A massive machine that had been hours away from dismantlement, saved by recognition of its preservation value, restored to operational condition through expertise and investment, and now serving an educational purpose while reminding everyone who saw it of the scale and power of the equipment that extracted the mineral civilization depended upon. Every visitor who marveled at the truck's size, who climbed into its cab to imagine operating such a machine, who learned about mining operations from the accompanying exhibits, represented a validation of the brothers' decision to preserve rather than destroy. This felt like success in its truest form, not merely financial gain, though that had certainly been significant, but lasting impact that extended beyond their own lifetimes. The truck would outlive them, continuing to educate and inspire long after they were gone. The mine would continue producing, potentially for decades, with each ton of extracted or generating royalties that would support their families. The businesses they had built and the mentorships they had provided would influence how others approached similar opportunities. The preservation of industrial heritage would continue because they had demonstrated its value through action rather than merely advocating for it in words. And it had all started with an $18,000 bid at a sparsely attended auction, a willingness to drive out to an abandoned mine site on a dusty morning, and the curiosity to open a storage compartment beneath an operator's seat. From such small moments, from such simple decisions, entire futures could emerge in ways that were impossible to predict but beautiful to experience. Thank you for watching this incredible story. If you enjoyed it, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that super thanks button to support more amazing content like this. We love hearing from our global community. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to bring you more unbelievable stories of hidden treasures, unexpected discoveries, and the people who had the vision to see value where others saw only scrap. Until next time, keep your eyes open for opportunity. You never know what fortune might be hiding in plain sight.